So how does your association know how much money you need to put into your reserves each month to offset deterioration? Well, there are 4 factors. 1, your association's physical makeup. 2, your starting reserve balance. 3, the amount of cash margin you'd like built into your reserve plan. And 4, the mathematical tool used to calculate reserve funding. In this portion of our webinar, our Carolinas Regional Office President Wayne Johnson shares which 2 of these 4 factors you do actually control, and he shows you how the results all come together very nicely for your association's unique reserve funding recommendation. So Wayne, now with the table all set, what does affect the size of our reserve funding recommendations?
Thanks a lot, Robert. I'm glad to be here with you and our audience today. We're here to talk about how much is required to fund reserves at your association. It usually seems like reserve funding recommendations are a lot of money, but owning real estate is expensive. Asphalt is expensive. Elevators are expensive. Really, the key to minimizing your reserve funding needs is to spread the cost out nice and small over time. There are 4 factors that affect the size of your reserve funding recommendation. First is the components, the physical assets you're responsible for maintaining. Second is your financial starting point. Is it strong or weak? Third, how much margin for unexpected special assessments suits your association? And finally, even the calculation method used by whoever is calculating your reserve study makes a big difference. These 4 things are what I'll be covering in the next few minutes. Regarding the component list, obviously some associations have more or less common areas, and some have more expensive types of common areas than others. So the cost of maintaining and repairing the common areas will be different for each association. It's all summarized in your reserve component list that will look something like this. If you missed it, we discussed reserve component selection in detail in our Reserve Studies 101 webinar, and it's available on our website or on YouTube. Then we teach about the unavoidable ongoing cost of your component deterioration, and that's mentioned in our Reserve Studies 102 webinar. The ongoing cost of deterioration is a fact of life at your association due to construction style, types of amenities, and level of maintenance. Like our Reserve Studies 101 program, it's also available on our website and on YouTube. Second is your starting point, the size of your reserve fund. At this time, do you know if your reserve fund is strong, fair, or weak? Your reserve funding requirements will be different if your reserve fund is strong and you can coast along in good shape, or if your reserves are weak and you're going to have to hustle to gather some money together for an upcoming project. Calculating your fully funded balance on the basis of your component list and learning is the first step. Then you compare your reserve fund to that fully funded balance to learn your percent funded, which reveals your reserves, if your reserves are strong or weak. That's another topic we cover in our Reserve Studies 102 webinar. Again, if you missed it, you can find that on our website or on YouTube. Third is how much margin for the unexpected is right for your association. That has to do with the size of major projects in your association's future and how close or far away they are. Again, it's based on your component list. This chart shows the anticipated projects from that sample component list I showed moments ago. So the question about margin has to do with how well prepared you want your association to be for these anticipated future expenses. Do you want to just barely have enough cash on to be able to pay to get these projects done? Or like the green line, do you want a little bit of margin on hand in case these projects occur a little early or a little more than you expected? Some margin is good. The question here is how much extra do you want to have on hand to prevent special assessments? That's another foundational topic that we cover in more detail on our Reserve Studies 102 webinar. This choice is described by your funding goal. If you're pursuing full funding, threshold funding, or just baseline funding. In this chart, the blue bars show fully funded balance through the years, the amount of deterioration at the association in each of these years. The red line near the bottom shows what it looks like pursuing a baseline funding goal, just barely providing enough cash through the years to keep the reserve balance barely positive. And this chart highlights the green line where the association is pursuing a fully funded balance target. The association will have more cash on hand through the years to handle the unexpected. Now, you might want to ask yourself, why would any association want to sit on a bunch of cash? And that's really a good question. The reason why is shown here. Associations pursuing a baseline funding goal have less cash on hand. So with a low percent funded on the left side of the chart, they much more commonly experience special assessments, because if we're honest about what we've learned in life, nothing ever goes exactly according to plan. Associations pursuing a threshold funding goal somewhere in the middle of baseline funding and full funding in the yellow middle section of the chart experience special assessments infrequently because they have a little more cash on hand. I hope you're starting to see that the money in the bank is not just sitting unused. It is reducing the chance of owners getting hit with a special assessment because they kept their reserve fund too lean, giving back to the association all that they thought they had saved. And look here at the green portion of the chart on the right side of the screen. Associations pursuing a full funding goal rarely have special assessments, almost 0% of the time. And that's the value of having more cash on hand. It's there to be spent for the projects at the association that need to get done that otherwise could cause special assessments. It's not money sitting idle in the bank. We recommend full funding because we don't want our clients suffering from avoidable special assessments. And how much does this cost? Full funding reserve transfers are typically 10 to 20% higher than baseline funding reserve transfers. Again, it doesn't result in money sitting in the bank unused. It means fewer disruptive special assessments that would take money from the homeowners because the association slowly and gradually collected a little bit more each month, enough to pay the cost of repairing and replacing the association's common area components. This is one of the areas where you get to make a choice. The fourth factor is the mathematical calculation tool used for crafting the plan. There are two: the component method and the cash flow method. And making a wise choice is very important. Usually this choice is made by your reserve study professional. Between the component method, also called the straight line, and the cash flow method, also called pooled, the cash flow method is the clear winner. Very simply, it is more flexible and more advantageous to the association. The funding profile over the years can be crafted to maximize smoothness and fairness to the owners. And it also is easily adjusted to provide more or less funding margin, as I spoke about a moment ago. But sometimes an association volunteer will just go down a path using one or the other, not really appreciating what they're doing. I'll show you in the next few slides how the choice of which tool is used is often very significant, and it affects the size of your association's calculated reserve funding needs. Let me start by describing the component method. Why would anyone use this? This topic is significant primarily to associations in Florida and New Jersey, where state law points associations in this direction. This is also significant for individuals building their own reserve funding plans on a spreadsheet because the component method is very simple. Just do a calculation for each component one at a time and sum it up at the bottom of the list. So the component method is kind of an up and down way to calculate reserve funding requirements. Let me walk you through it. Let's take the second component from that list, pool resurfacing. It's a $10,000 project that needs to be done every 10 years. With that in mind, when the pool is new, and without complicating this illustration with interest or inflation, you have 10 years to collect $10,000. So your reserve funding requirements are $10,000 divided by 10 years or $1,000 per year. That's pretty simple. But if the association doesn't make all its budgeted reserve transfers and gets to the 5-year-old point, halfway to when it needs to be replaced, but only has $2,500 set aside instead of $5,000, then the association has 5 years to fund the remaining $7,500 needed to prepare for this $10,000 expense. That's $7,500 over 5 years. So now the reserve funding needs for this component are $1,500 a year. In other words, getting a little behind on reserve funding has made the reserve funding requirement for the remaining years much higher. They are clearly in catch-up mode. Now let's let the association get a few more years down the road. Their pool reserve has grown to $6,000. But now they only have 2 years until they need the $10,000 to resurface the pool. So they need to collect the remaining $4,000 in the last 2 years, or $2,000 per year. Their reserve funds are now need to be twice what they would have needed to collect if they'd been setting aside reserves responsibly through the years. This is what I was talking about a few moments ago about the importance of your starting reserve fund strength. But let's say they are able to collect the necessary funds, and so the project gets done. Then their cycle is reset, and they're back to having 10 years to collect the next $10,000 to replace it again. That, of course, means their reserve funding needs for this component drop back down to $1,000 a year. This is an opportunity for the board to enjoy learning their reserve funding requirements have dropped. This little example illustrates the problems with the component method of funding. Their boards find that if they get behind, the funding requirement begins to climb up pretty steeply, but if it drops down again right after the expense, then you have a full useful life cycle to prepare for the next project. Funding plans calculated with the component method, where each component's reserve funding requirement is calculated separately, tend to be high in the first few catch-up years, dropping as the project gets accomplished. This is the shock many associations face when starting a reserve funding plan. Using the component method, they face their highest costs right in the first few years. In the cash flow method, all we care about are the expenses per year, not line items. So we look at the annual cash needs of the association and design a multi-year funding plan that smoothly provides for the projected expenses. It's a matter of looking at the needs of the association from left to right, not up and down. You design or create a funding plan that provides the desired amount of margin or protection from special assessments desired by the association. So remember that we're dealing with exactly the same expenses. The component method looks at projects one at a time from top of the list to the bottom, while the cash flow method deals with exactly the same expenses, just looking at them 1 year to the next, left to right. And when you do that, you can create a funding plan that is smooth over the years, gradually floating upwards with inflation. If you remember the 4 funding principles Robert showed at the beginning, this type of funding plan very nicely meets the equitable distribution funding principle. This is possible because your focus is on the annual cash needs, not individual component needs. In the cash flow method, all expenses share one reserve fund, so there's never a rush in the last few years of the component's life. Reserve income and reserve expenses can be smoothly balanced through the years because all the reserve funding goes into the pool, and all the expenditures come out from that same pool. A lot of sharing and no rushing. This means reserve funds can be used more efficiently than being divided up into all those separate different accounts where each component stood on its own. When I show them side by side, it's pretty clear. The same net funds go into the reserves over the years. Remember, they pay for exactly the same expenses over the years. It's just that the cash flow method doesn't force associations to pay a steep price in the first few years to rapidly resolve any underfunding. So in either method, the same total amount goes into reserves, but the cash flow method is and always will be a more efficient use of the association's reserves and will always be more favorable to the vast majority of associations in the country that find themselves in at least somewhat of an underfunded situation. The cash flow method makes life in an underfunded association so much more palatable. What's important to note is that initial year funding requirements calculated with the component method are regularly about twice as much as funding requirements calculated by the cash flow method. That's why we so clearly state that it's best to avoid the component method. Reserve professionals across the country try to avoid that. If you're calculating your own reserve funding requirements by the component method, where each component reserve needs are funded individually, you should stop doing that. Hire a reserve study professional and let them create a smoother funding profile for your association using the cash flow methodology that doesn't punish your homeowner so severely in the first years of the plan.
Fantastic, Wayne. I love hearing you talk through that. It's so plain and easy to understand. And the other good thing is you didn't ask anyone to pull out a calculator. At Association Reserves, we make the present less stressful and the future more secure. If you want to join us in this mission, please like this video and subscribe to our channel. Leave a comment down below on what you'd like to see us address in a future video. Let's plan for your best future.